Why study literary theory? Literary theory enables a broad appreciation of global literature. Reading text through the lens of history provides the reader a new perspective on the literature they read and allows the reader to learn more about the author's intentions. In short, literary theory provides the reader a toolbox for approaching literary texts. Literary theory is the work of explaining or interpreting literary text. Literary theory is the act of interpretation itself. Every time you discuss or evaluate a text, you are participating in literary criticism. Book reviews are the most common form of text evaluation. When we engage in literary criticism, there are two main types of literary criticism. You've got evaluative criticism, which determines the place a piece of literature holds in history. Interpretive criticism, where the reader finds meaning in a story and what that story means to the reader. In this lecture, I will go over different ways in which you can criticize and look over literature. There are many schools of literary theory that we will explore. Formalism, feminism, genderism, queer theory, Marxism, cultural studies, post-colonial literature, historical criticism, psychoanalytic literature criticism, reader response theory, structuralism, post-structuralism, and ecocentrism. The first one, formalism and new criticism. In this school of thought, we study the structure, tone, character, setting, symbols, and linguistic features of a text. We talk about how the different parts of the text relate to each other to create meaning. So when we write our literary essay or our reader response journal, we comment on how the tone, characters, settings, and symbols interact in the story, and we take apart the text to analyze the deeper meaning of the text. For instance, what is the deeper meaning of Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe? You learn that the beating heart of the dead person represents the guilt the author felt when he murdered the old man. Formalism and new criticism is a form of structuralism where you examine the structure of a story to determine a fixed meaning for the story. So just like Telltale Heart represents guilt, Shakespeare's sonnets represent romantic love, and Moby Dick by Herman Melville is a story about revenge. Feminist criticism. In feminist criticism, we focus on the role of women in literature, and where patriarchy, that is men domineering societies, left women in early 20th century feel trapped. In stories such as Trifles by Susan Claspel, we will be reading this play in week 7, where a married woman kills her husband. In Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, where a wife dies when she learns her husband is still alive. In The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, where a wife goes insane locked in her room by her husband, who only means well. And Edna Pontellier in The Awakening by Kate Chopin, and Edna drowns and commits suicide to escape her controlling husband. These stories illustrate how miserable married women were without any rights in the early 20th century. So feminist criticism is also a form of historical criticism, as historical criticism examines the role of history. So in feminist criticism, you learn about how women in the past had fewer rights than they do now. Gender literary criticism. Gender literary criticism highlights gender roles in literature and highlights the relationship between the sexes. In the poem The Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, the aging speaker feels his masculinity is called into question because he has become old and middle-aged and no longer able to attract women like he used to when he was younger. You'll be reading this poem in the Week 5 Poetry Unit when we do the Week 5 discussion. Queer theory literary criticism. Recent schools of gender studies arose in the 1990s and highlights the role of gays and lesbians in literature, and that the usual female-male division are culturally constructed rather than present at birth. Dixa Ramirez de Leo, associate professor of English, noted that her research is not in queer theory, but that La Lotte by Shola von Reinhardt is an LGBTQ text she would recommend this Pride Month. written by queer Afro-Scottish author. The book is one of the best novels out there about anything, she emphasized in an email to the Herald. Marxism Literary Criticism. Marxism literary criticism uses literature to forward a socialist political system. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, noted that human interactions are economically driven. Human progress is measured as a struggle for power between different social classes. Either you are powerful oppressors or you're a powerless victim. In literary characters, that would translate into a conflict between the powerful oppressors and the powerless victims. And so in a story, this would be like bosses and workers, landowners and peasants, or masters versus slaves. Marxism criticism explores how socioeconomic forces affect people's lives. Examples of such criticism would be Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and the Hunger Games are both examples of literary works that lend themselves to Marxism criticism. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, for instance, presents the relationship of Huckleberry, sort of the master, and Jim, the runaway slave. Cultural studies, literary criticism. Cultural study, literary criticism seeks to critique the traditional view of what constitutes high-class literature, like Shakespeare, Milton, and other classic literature by usually dead, white, heterosexual males. Cultural study seeks to broaden the traditional literary canon by including literature from other ethnicities, such as African American literature, Asian American literature, female writers, gay and lesbian writers, Hispanic writers, and more. Cultural studies seeks to make what we consider as high-class literature to be more inclusive and to include everyone, and that there is no distinction between high-class and popular and low-class literature, and that any distinction between these kinds of literature is all culturally constructed, but in reality, all literature is the same. It's all a story about humanity. Post-colonial literary criticism. Post-colonial literary criticism seeks to explore literature from Europe's former colonies, mainly British colonies, and it demands that the voices of indigenous writers be heard. Post-colonial literature studies the effect of European colonial culture on language, art, architecture, politics, law, philosophy, race, and sex. For instance, when Joseph Conrad wrote his book, Heart of Darkness, where Conrad wrote about his travels to Africa in the early 20th century, he fails to grant full humanity to Africans and instead sees Africans as savages. Therefore, Conrad reflects the racist colonial standpoint of the early 20th century. On the other hand, Chinua Achebe, an renowned African writer, in his novel Things Fall Apart, depicts Africans in their full humanity, as the book is written by an African author. So post-colonial literature presupposes a history of exploitation and racism of Europeans on the members of their colonies. Now, when I did my PhD dissertation also, I did it from the point of view of post-colonial literary criticism. So my thesis statement was the image of China in 19th century France in the works of Pierre Loti, Paul Claudel, and Victor Ségolène. Pierre Loti saw Chinese as beautiful ornamental porcelain and as objects and as savages. Paul Claudel saw Chinese people as heathens, and Victor Ségolène saw Chinese people as the exotic other. Historical criticism. Historical criticism examines the role of history or the influence of the life and times of the author on a piece of literature. For instance, Alex Haley's Roots examines the family history of author Alex Haley, who travels back to Africa to find out where his ancestors came from. Also, when we read Farewell to Manzanar by Janine Watasaki, Houston, she talks about her childhood in a Japanese internment camp and how this affected her life. In historical criticism, we examine the role of history in a piece of literature and how that history influenced that piece of literature. Psychoanalytic literary criticism. Psychoanalytic critical literary criticism examines the role of the conscious and subconscious in literature. And psychoanalytic literary criticism is heavily influenced by Sigmund Freud. So in psychoanalytic literary criticism, we examine the character's inner thoughts and desires and how these inner thoughts influence the story. We explore what unconscious urges drove the author to write that story. Special attention is given to the meaning of symbols to discuss the psychological state of the character. The poem, The Love Song of Alfred Prufrock, examines Prufrock's social anxiety of becoming middle-aged and becoming too unattractive to get a date, to the point that he questions his own masculinity. So when we examine the inner thoughts or unconscious desires of a character in a story, we are engaging in psychoanalytic literary criticism. Ecocentrism literary criticism. Ecocentrism examines the role of nature in literature. When a poem writes about the beauty of nature and makes nature the focal point of his story, then we are engaging in ecocentrism literary criticism. For instance, when we analyze a story because it is a story about nature, that is also ecocentrism literary criticism. And so when we study the haiku poems, the Japanese haiku poems are mainly about literature. The Japanese poets in haiku write about the beauty of the sun, the beauty of a flower. So that is ecocentrism literary criticism. Another example is when we analyze the creation story in Genesis, in the Bible, that uses the creation of nature, when God created nature, and when God created the universe, and how that creation of nature and the universe laid the foundation for human history. So that is also ecocentrism literary criticism. There are other poets like Walden and that also wrote many beautiful poems about the beauty of nature, where human interactions and human emotion takes backstage to nature, and nature is front and center. Structuralism literary criticism is very similar to the very first one we did, formal criticism and new criticism, formalism and new criticism, where structuralism talks about the analysis of how poetic and prose structure are popular in historical context by comparing this poem to other poems at that time. When we compare the sonnets of Shakespeare with other poets' poems of that time, we are engaging in structuralism. The four elements of structuralism are sensations, images, affections, and emotions. And so in structuralism, the literature has one fixed meaning. In other words, you put the piece of literature into a structure, and you evaluate that piece of literature from a historical point of view in relationship to other pieces of literature at that time. So in many ways, it's similar to historical criticism, in which you're studying that piece of literature in history. So that's very similar to historical. See, a lot of these literary criticisms all overlap. So for instance, Langston Hughes wrote his poetry during the Harlem Renaissance. And so therefore, when you classify a piece of literature into a certain category, that's known as literary criticism. Post-structure, in other words, you create a structure into which this piece of literature belongs. And so here's an easy example of structuralism. The apple is crisp, tart, and therefore is a fruit. So therefore, that categorizes what exactly is an apple. In the same way, Shakespeare's sonnets are poems about romantic love. So that's structuralism. In other words, the piece of literature has one fixed meaning and belongs to a certain category, such as Harlem Renaissance or romantic love. Post-structuralism means that a piece of literature has no fixed meaning, and that a piece of literature can have endless interpretations. So here we're doing post-structuralism, that each piece of literature has interconnected ideas. All is relative. You can interpret the literature any way you want. When we take apart a piece of literature to examine it piece by piece, and we take apart the story structure of a piece of literature, we are engaging in deconstructing the text to find extra layers of meaning, which is exactly what you are doing for your reader response journals. And so therefore you've got a lot of overlap between post-structuralism, deconstruction, and formal criticism, whereby you take apart a piece of literature by looking at its setting, its structure, characterization, and tone. But unlike structuralism, where the piece of literature has one fixed meaning, in other words, Shakespeare is just about romantic love, Tell-Tale Heart is just about guilt. In post-structuralism, Tell-Tale Heart can have many different meanings, or not just about guilt. And Shakespeare's sonnets can have many different dimensions, not just about romantic love. So that's that's a difference between post-structuralism and structuralism. Structuralism puts something into a category and pigeonholes that piece of literature, whereas post-structuralism liberates you, and you can have as many interpretations as you want. In other words, the reader reads into the piece of, now we're approaching reader response, as the reader is the one who finds meaning in the text. So reader response is a subcategory of post-structuralism. Remember, post-structuralism is when we take apart the text and we find endless interpretations of it. That's post-structuralism. And so when a reader response is a kind of post-structuralism literary criticism, because we're taking apart the text and then we have endless interpretations of that text based on your life experience. And so in this class, we are engaging in reader response literary theory that's both post-structuralist and somewhat structuralist. So reader response literary theory asks what the reader thinks of the text and asks the reader to respond to what he has read. Reader response analysis involves how the reader interprets and takes apart the text to find extra layers of meaning. Like post-structuralism dogma, there is no fixed meaning to the text, and there can be endless interpretations as each student brings his unique life experiences to the story. You can have 30 students reading the same story and have 30 different interpretations of that story. The reader derives meaning or extra layers of meaning from the text. The text becomes an interaction between the reader and the author. Reader response theory makes meaning out of the words on a page. We fill in the gaps the words do not tell us with our interpretation. Therefore, reading becomes an active, interactive process by which the meaning of the text unfolds as you read it. The meaning of the text can change over time. For example, when you read that same story as a child, you take the literal meaning of the story. Bad guy versus good guy. Black versus, everything is black and white. But when we reread the same story, we see the shades of gray because we've become more experienced. We can see, well, that villain wasn't such a bad guy after all. He was just having a bad week, for instance. And so everything becomes shades of gray. So therefore, in reader response literary theory and in post-structuralism, you can have endless interpretations that changes over time. Whereas in structuralism, you just have one fixed meaning that stays the same throughout time. And this is hence the postmodernist notion of endless interpretations and no fixed meaning for a text is the most advanced literary criticism that we use today in studying literature and in evaluating literature. So I hope that you understood. I went really fast over the 13, 14 kinds of literary criticisms so that you wouldn't fall asleep with Zoom fatigue. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. And I could have talked a lot longer about this topic if I wanted to.